poussette, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué, poussette, je t'aime, poussette, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée.
Hello there and welcome to Brussels, My Love, Euronews' weekly talk show about the news bubbling here in Brussels and beyond. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for tuning in. Coming up this week, with EU elections around the corner and party manifestos being printed out, one word coming up more and more is defence. Today, Europe buys 8 in 10 weapons from suppliers outside the bloc, something the Commission wants to change by fundamentally revamping its industry. What does that mean in reality? And is it just a pipe dream? And after 8 years of rule, Portugal has said adeus to the socialists. Last weekend's legislative elections showed a big surge for the centre-right Conservatives and for a new right-wing firebrand. We analyse the frustration with the governing party in the country of 10 million people and check what all this could mean for the EU parliamentary elections taking place this June. Let's meet our panel this week. Maria João Rodrigues, the President of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Martha Muchnik, Senior EU Analyst at the International Crisis Group. And Sandra Pasadic, Project Officer from the Wilfred Martin Centre for European Studies. Thank you so much for coming in to us. It was a pretty busy week for MEPs, especially as well over in Strasbourg. There was big votes on the AI Act, on the media freedom. But actually what we want to zoom in on here is defence, which will be, of course, one of the big themes next week at the EU Summit.
Despite the rain, the mood was euphoric last Monday as the Swedish flag was raised in Brussels. After 200 years of neutrality, Sweden's armed forces now form part of NATO, as does its sophisticated domestic defense industry. Meanwhile, EU officials have started scratching their head for ways to develop Europe's defense companies. The Commission's recent defense industrial strategy looks to promote joint procurement of arms, just like how countries work together to buy COVID vaccines. But the question is, will it get the political and financial backing it needs to work?
So Maria, let's start with you. How realistic is this proposal?
Well, I would say that, first of all, it's important to welcome Sweden membership to NATO. But we need to ask how come a country which has a strong tradition of neutrality decides to ask for NATO membership. And I think this is because we are confronted with a deep change of the context. So we are coming from a moment where we had the collapse of the Soviet Union after Cold War, then we went to a unipolar moment. Now we are in a multipolar world, and one of the poles is an empire willing to expand, and it is in our continent. This is the situation we are confronted with.
And this is why we're having this conversation on defence, and we're speaking about things that many years ago perhaps would have been taboos. Martha, from the perspective of the International Crisis Group, I know you're following as well these talks on defence every step of the way. Did you follow the proposals from the Commission recently on their strategy, and what is your take on them?
Yes, we've been following these proposals as well as all the debate on security and defence. And just to add to Maria João's comments, I think it's security and defence are really at the forefront of the EU's agenda right now. Russia's war against Ukraine, of course, has really put these topics at the forefront of the European Council's agenda. You see successive European Councils increasingly being dominated by foreign and security policy issues, which wasn't exactly the case until recently. So this has completely changed the security environment of Europe. And this strategy, I think, in a way, is meant to sort of bridge the gap between rhetoric and action, because one of the things that many EU leaders have been sort of accused of, if you will, is the discrepancy between the stated rhetoric of Russia's aggression and then the capacity to act. And I think this Commission's proposal sort of tries to bridge that gap. And we as Crisis Group, we of course support that we have been saying that Western aid is vital for Ukraine's survival on the battlefield, and that the choices that Europe will need to make are essential and will bear significant impact on Ukraine's successes in the battlefield, while
and
also
even the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, in her speech in Strasbourg recently, she was calling on MEPs to wake up, calling on the whole bloc to wake up, in fact. And security and defence played a huge role at the European People's Congress as well last week in Bucharest. Sandra Pasaric, you were there, of course, with the Wilfred Martin Centre. How do you weigh in here on this debate?
Well, as a Croat and somebody who was born in 1991 during the war for the independence war and Serbia's aggression on my home country, Croatia, a war was never a construct. It was something, it was a reality, and it was a reality even that happened after the Second World War. We had indeed a war on the European continent. So therefore, I'm very pleased that finally we're talking about a common European industrial defence strategy with its own cash pot of 1.5 billion euros for it, which is the so-called European Defence Industrial Programme, which is aimed, I mean, we'll see now, because this commission is coming to an end, but most probably it should happen until the next year, 2025, and this should also be a focus of the next, let's hope, the von der Leyen's commission of the next period, 2025. So
well, for that we'll have to wait and see. And of course for this strategy, because now it's just a piece of paper on the table, it's a proposal, and we can show you more, in fact, what's in that proposal. You already mentioned the 1.5 billion euro from the budget of 2025 to 2027. But also, there's an idea there to use windfall profits from frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine and, of course, facilitate more cooperation between member states. But that's always a tricky one, isn't it, for member states to cooperate, especially on areas like this where in the past they've procured and only thought of themselves, really, when it comes to buying arms.
But look, we just learned this with the pandemics. We invented something new called joint procurement for vaccines. Now we need to have joint procurement for armament. And it's important to really to build up European defence capacity, accepting common standards, because if we put our capacities together, this makes a quite important total capacity. And joint procurement also help. And then we need to build the industrial base for this. Nevertheless, I'd like to underline that if we ask what is war nowadays, war is not just a military conflict. This is, in fact, the confrontation of two different choices of society. On one hand, we have one society, which is, in fact, an empire trying to expand, and based on something which is not democracy. We'll have this weekend election of a president, which in fact will remain a weak president, because who can be strong if he's elected on the basis of total absence of debate? And on the other hand, we have our democratic societies based on citizen choices, and we need to build our resilience. And resilience is about defense capacity, is about financial capacity, is about protecting our citizens and protecting our democracies.
So you're very clear on what we need to do and what is at stake, but are we able to get there?
I think in order for us to get there, we need public support. And I'm not sure personally the extent to which there is sort of an understanding or a public support on the part of public opinions in Europe, and I say specifically Western Europe. I think there's a clear understanding that there's an existential threat in Central and Eastern European countries. I'm not sure the extent to which this is an existential threat in Western Europe, and I think European leaders will need to do a lot to convince their own populations of the gravity of the situation if that's how they perceive it.
We're not obviously in Strasbourg, but MEPs were this week, so we wanted to hear their take on this proposal as well. So we sent our reporter Ida Sanchez to the corridors to turn the Euronews microphone on them. Take a listen.
Well, it is indeed a very ambitious program, but I think we need that ambition right now. We also look around the world, we look at traditional partners that we've had, which might end up in a logic of isolationism, and therefore European Union needs to be able to stand on its feet when it comes to defence. It's timely, package?
No, I would say it's completely the wrong way we are going on. It's not right to rearm all the time. It's not right that we try to build up a military union. We should work on peace of the world, on peace in Europe, and this is not the case now.
So two very different opinions there. And Özlem Demira, by the way, she's the vice chair of the Security and Defence Committee in the European Parliament. So you can imagine just how heated the debates are on this topic. Martha, would you agree with her, or do you think that's a bit naive?
I think that the right answer is probably a middle ground. Of course, I think it's clear that Europe needs to take greater responsibility for its own security, to act more as a security provider for its own neighborhood. It can't depend on the United States, and it cannot depend on what voters on the other side of the Atlantic decide to do regarding its own security. If it's an if Russian aggression is an existential threat, as many European leaders perceive it to be, then we need to ramp up production. We need to ramp up defense capabilities and work towards that goal. But at the same time, we need to keep open the possibility of talks and dialogue with Russia when the time comes, to sort of when we feel like there's enough signals from Moscow that that suggest that negotiations could happen on terms compatible to Ukraine's security and European long-term security as well.
Would you agree with that?
Well, those statements that we just heard was from the exiting MEPs. We are having elections now in June, and the European People's Party is even calling further. Not only are we talking about this industrial defence strategy that is very needed, we are also talking and calling for a commissioner for defence and security. We are also calling for a council on defence and security. We are also calling on common procurement. We are also calling on opening an defence innovation office in Kiev. And the European People's Party is also very much aware that defence, it's not only about attacking or going into war with somebody, it's also about deterrence, and this is also a very important point. And this is also it's going to be a very structural and central point of our electioning campaign: defence, migration, and climate as well.
And also, that was very clear in your manifesto, but not perhaps as clear in your manifesto. You were in Rome, of course, on stage as the Socialist Congress were meeting just a couple of weeks ago. What role will defence and security play in your messaging to your potential voters?
Well, you can be sure that we are very clear on the need to build up European defence capabilities. We cannot be naive. But let me say something very clear. We, European societies, we are peaceful societies. We don't want to make wars on the others. We don't want to invade the others. So when Putin is saying is under threat of being invaded, we need to say loud and clear, for whatever the Russian citizen listen to us today, this is completely wrong. This is fake. And we have a war which is also a battle of narratives, and Putin's narrative is completely invented.
So how will you counter that when you speak to your voters?
But on the other hand, we cannot be naive, because in fact there was an invasion of a European country, abiding to our values, and therefore we need to have a bold strategy. And this means to build up defense capacity, to build our resilience as societies, so protecting our cities and democracies, but also, let me also underline a very important point, enlargement strategy. Because we have made a choice about this.
And but I'm sure our viewers are looking on here saying, who's going to pay for this? Because they're struggling to make ends meet.
Exactly.
They're worried about healthcare. They're worried about issues close to their heart.
Point.
So what would you say to them?
It's a very good question. I think it's what I've already said. I think it's about putting this issue in the campaigns of national legislative elections, for example. We just had Portuguese elections, and we are going to speak about that in a moment, but those issues were completely absent from the debate. This is just an example. So it's about clarifying the electorate of what it means, of the consequences of Ukraine's defeat. So those are the choices. It's about clarifying the electorate about the choices that they have to make. But those debates need to happen inside European societies.
And just when it comes to Ukraine, the reason we're having these conversations is, of course, because the war is still very much ongoing, almost 3 years on. And we all remember a couple of weeks ago the French President, Emmanuel Macron, what he said, how he was willing to put all options on the table. How did you interpret his comments?
Well, for me, he was just fishing for some headlines, to be honest, because he wasn't really reflecting the image and also the position that France has, because according to Kiel's Institute for World Economy, France is 22nd out of 27 EU member states that have made 8 commitments in percentages of their national GDP to Ukraine. So therefore, he's obviously trying, and France is one of the countries that is spending the most on defence in the EU. So obviously, according to their equipment, they just want to have a greater position, but he doesn't know how to express it. So for me, it was a complete nonsense.
It was a complete nonsense? I mean...
Look, yes, the words were not completely the right kind of words. Nevertheless, a war means to put real means on the table, which is now underway, and on the other hand, to keep possibilities open, but without specifying. And you went too far by specifying. This is my critical comment on this.
Well, the whole debate then opened up about whether or not we should be sending European troops to help Ukrainians who are clearly exhausted on the ground. There's a massive recruitment plan over in Ukraine. We've heard reports as well of young men just being taken as they go to the supermarket and told to go to the front line because they're needed so desperately. And there's also the draft mobilisation bill. We've seen the Czech president weigh in, Peter Pavel, saying that there was nothing to prevent NATO member states and European countries sending troops as well as civilians to help Ukraine fight this war. From your perspective, what would you say here?
I think that sending Western troops to Ukraine is a very premature discussion. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we as crisis group, of course, we reject any type of escalatory rhetoric that can sort of contribute to escalation of tensions and to bring a direct confrontation with Russia. So we believe that this type of rhetoric is not helpful in any way to bring an end to the conflict. And as much as we support Western aid to Ukraine should be a priority for European policymakers, there's a big difference between that and engaging in very escalatory rhetoric at this point.
But I'm sorry, because I think the real problem here, which is, I hope, on the table for the European choices in the European elections, is on the one hand, we need to build up European defence capability. On the other hand, we need to have means to conduct the green transition, the digital transition, to protect ours. And all this is costly. So from my viewpoint, we Europeans, we need to be prepared to come up with much stronger financial instruments, combining joint issue of European debt to finance very important priorities which are unavailable.
That's a big debate, in fact, that's coming up. I've seen a lot of editorials on that point. Would you have a say on that?
I mean, I agree definitely it's about prioritising, and we'll see this in the next legislative period. But also we need to be aware that we are already in a certain point and at a certain level in a war with Russia. There are cyber attacks. We're going to see also now interference in the European elections. So there is a real opposed threat, because nowadays wars are not only being fought on front, in the air, on the sea, on the land. They're also being fought in cyber spectrum. And
so
this
do you think
is also
Europeans should go from here, from EU countries? They should mobilise?
No, this is far away from saying no.
Well, just on something concrete, there was some good news this week for Ukraine on revamping their military assistance, and that was the €5 billion European peace facility that was agreed on Wednesday by ambassadors here in Brussels after months and months of wrangling. Is this a good news?
Yes, that's definitely a good news. This was something that was being withheld for a few weeks, months, due to Franco-German differences on the modalities on reforming this Ukraine Assistance Fund. I think it's definitely news that should be welcomed. We don't know exactly how the fund is going to work, and I've seen reports that the fund is meant to reimburse, that the bilateral aid donations are going to be calculated and factored in this fund. So there's still a question mark about what if this is entirely new money for Ukraine. But in any case, this initiative, coupled with a Czech-led initiative of buying ammunition to deliver to Ukraine, are very positive signals, and I think a signal also that Europe is sort of going in the right direction. And before starting discussing sending troops to the ground, these are the issues that we need to focus on.
This is more concrete. And just on their differences, the Franco-German differences, there will be a meeting this Friday between Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor. But I'm afraid we are out of time for that topic. But I'm sure we'll be hearing about it, of course, much more in the coming months. But stay with us, because after the break, we will have an update on the Portuguese elections. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekend talk show with me, Maeve McMahon. Now, this week, the European bubble was digesting the outcome of Portugal's snap parliamentary elections that saw the socialists wiped off the map after 8 years in power. The big winners, the centre-right Aliança Democrática, then the socialists, and then third place went to a newish party on the scene, Chega, an anti-establishment nationalist group fronted by André Ventura, a former football commentator seemingly and aspiring priest. Maria, you are, of course, a Portuguese politician. You represent the socialist group. What went wrong? How did you lose touch with the people?
Well, Socialist Party lost for a small margin, 2 seats in the parliament and 50,000 votes. But it lost. And so we need to take stock seriously. Why? From my viewpoint, the record has been positive in the sense of turning the page of austerity after a very painful financial crisis, Eurozone crisis in Portugal, and then start to raise salaries, creating more jobs, raising growth. But at the same time, that's why the Portuguese case is very interesting, it was possible to reduce public deficit, public debt, to raise the ratings. So it was considered an interesting case. How can we have budgetary responsibility on one hand, but also improve people's lives? Nevertheless, then we are confronted with cost of living and several criticism and protests coming from particular groups in the health sector, in the education sector, even in security, farmers.
Okay.
And
let's bring in some more views, because we have 2 Portuguese around the table. We're very privileged here. Well, I know one of the big headlines in Brussels from this election was, of course, that it's a very divided parliament as well. I mean, what other reactions have you heard around here?
Yes, it's a very divided parliament, a very fragmented parliament. So I think we're following the general European trend where we're seeing a bit the decline of the traditional dominance of the central right, the center right or the center left. So no stable majorities. We don't know if there will be elections anytime soon again, because it's very difficult to envision how the government will be able to, how the new government will be able to govern without a stable majority. And of course, the rise of the far right, it's a serious source of concern. For Portugal, it was a very rapid rise. I mean, until 2019, this political party Chega was created in 2019. Until then, we didn't have far right in Portugal.
And now, Sandra, André Ventura is all over the papers this week.
Right. From the centre-right perspective, we could perceive these elections with on a positive and a negative side. Positive is obviously that our candidate, Luis Montenegro, who was also one of the key speakers at the EPP Congress last week, he won the elections, and the Socialists, they not only did they lose by 2 seats, by the margin of 2 votes, but they also lost around, I think, 77 seats in the National Assembly, and also those elections were called after the corruption allegations against former Prime Minister Costas. So the good news is that now, from the European Parliament's perspective, in Europe you only have 4 socialist governments, and this is ahead of the European elections. On the other side, André Ventura, indeed, he is the I wouldn't say the winner, but he did win the majority, and he grew his support by 16%, comparing it.
And he won all the headlines. I mean, let's be honest, everyone's been talking about André Ventura all week. But we wanted to get more reactions as well from Portugal. So we spoke to the climate analyst Duarte Costa, who told us what this election could mean for the upcoming European elections.
This election in Portugal is of utmost importance for the rest of the EU. We are 3 months away from the European elections, and what we are seeing here is one of the strongholds of European support. We know Portugal is one of the most pro-Europe countries, and when I say Portugal, I mean the people of Portugal. This country is now being taken over by the far right. If we love Europe, if we love Brussels, like your program says, we have to do something. I think our European EU bubble has failed in making this European project that is so important, so beautiful, so unique in the world, close to people's lives.
Duarte Costa there making the point that governing parties are far away from the lives of ordinary people. And he told us he's so frustrated with the state of his country, he's actually running for elections. So you might see his face pop up a little bit more. But I mean, you're all part of this EU bubble. Has the bubble failed, Martha, to get the message out?
I think it's unfair to say that the bubble failed. I think national politicians and mainstream politicians also failed in addressing the concerns of the voters, in trying to be more in touch with what the voters are concerned about in their daily lives. Not a lot of debate has been happening in Portugal about what do these 1 million voters that voted for André Ventura, are they all racists, xenophobes, far right? Are they voting for André Ventura because of ideological reasons? Not necessarily. A lot of them, we know that Chega has been capturing votes also from the far left. So it's not necessarily because of ideology. Of course, there are some who are voting. We are also seeing a normalization of the far right rhetoric. But
and I would also say André Ventura is a textbook politician, populist politician. He really used very, very simple messages to get across, to reach out to the citizens. Because also what is very interesting for these elections is that you had the biggest turnout since 1995. You had 66.2%, and he reached out to the young voters, very young voters who really have problems with youth unemployment, who have housing issues, the renting prices, they're going up. And we could see this all across Europe. He's reaching out to the young voters, not only using their media channels, social media, but he also uses people who look like them. He also uses young people that are aged from 18 to 22.
Could you take some tricks from him, perhaps?
Look, I think it's really important to make a distinction between the far-right leaders, on one hand, and people voting for them. And we need to understand people's concerns, because, in fact, they are people's concerns. And my point is that the solution proposed by the far-right is not the good one. Why? For two main reasons. One, because far-right argues that we can meet people's concerns by just changing national policies. No, most of the problems need to have action at national level, local level, but also European level. How can we deal with the climate, migration?
But their communication skills are stellar. And they're obviously where the people are.
Yes.
Whether that's
they also promise what they cannot deliver.
And I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there because we've run out of time. But it's a fascinating discussion we will definitely come back to as we get closer to those June elections. But thank you so much for being with us. And thank you so much for watching. Take care. And we'll see you soon here on Euronews. And of course, if you need more analysis, euronews.com. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon. Along with Maria João Rodrigues, Marta Muchnik and Sandra Pasadic, we're just taking a look back at the news of the week. And one image that really struck us, on the heels, of course, of International Women's Day, was that of famous Spanish footballers taking centre stage in Strasbourg. You might remember their Me Too moment last year when the former Spanish Soccer Federation president, Luis Rubiales, kissed the midfielder Jenny Hermoso during the awards ceremony. This week, the ladies told the European Parliament why it was so important for them to be there.
For what has been achieved in recent years, to move forward for progress. But what we should really be here today for is not for the past, but for the future. We have to push forward this path hand in hand, and it involves, as with almost everything else, education.
El deporte emociona.
Sport excites, transforms and educates. We must know how to use it correctly. We must give girls all over the world female role models in which they can see themselves reflected. And I'll tell you one thing, the next Alexia Putellas is out there, the next Aitana Bonmati is out there, and the next Diani is out there. They just want a chance and we have to give it to them.
Y debemos dársela.
A strong message there that we shouldn't perhaps just be focusing on the Beckhams, the Ronaldos of the football world, but also the Putellas and the Bonmatis, the famous Spanish female footballers. Sandra, what do you think has changed, if anything, since those World Cup events?
Well, I have been indeed following this in real time, the infamous now kiss between Rubiales and Jenny Hermoso, and you could see really the Spanish audience, the Spanish public divided. So it was not so much about that the Spanish national team, female team, won the World Cup, but it was more about this incident. So I would also say the images that we just saw is one side of the coin. So you see there a Spanish team, a female Spanish team winning the cup, also a female European Parliament's president, but also on the other side of the coin, there is still a lot of domestic female violence. Also in the public, you could also see in condemning also Jenny Hermoso that she was she was consenting this kiss. So there is really a long way to go, and the European Union's approach should be really comprehensive and more aggressive towards the women's rights and equality.
I think this episode was deplorable, but what really matters is that when it comes to sports, gender equality means for women to have equal chances to practice all kinds of sports. And this team has won the World Cup, and they don't have the same conditions to practice soccer as men, because they are working women in other jobs. They need to pay for their engagement in sports. So there is a lot to be done. This legislature was quite productive in this sense, because we could adopt directives on equal pay, on women's in boards, in work-life balance. We improve access to care services.
And many would argue
Many
would argue the reason is because we had a female European Commission president.
Yeah, which
let's just bring in Marta on that.
I agree with what both Sandra and Maria João have said, but I think it's key to have female representation in key positions of power, whether in sports, the private sector, journalism, politics, anywhere, and only then will things actually change, and will these issues of sexual harassment, abuse of power, gender pay, gender inequality will be effectively tackled when we have women at the top deciding on these matters.
And also, regardless of the FAM committee in the European Parliament, there is still not a definition of consent-based definition of rape on the table. So there are a lot of women suffering from this basic right of...
Indeed. But I'm afraid we have run out of time. Thank you so much, Maria João Rodriguez, Marta Muchnik and Sandra Pasaric for being with us here. And thank you so much for watching. And I couldn't sign off, of course, without wishing everyone a very happy St. Patrick's Day. Although the 17th of March holiday began as a Christian feast, now it's a global week-long celebration of all things Irish. As usual, if you have any comments for us here, please reach out. brusselsmylove@euronews.com. That is our email address. You can also catch us on social media. And stay tuned for next week. We'll have a very special edition. We'll be live from Brussels with the studio audience. Stay tuned.